What they didn't know was that I had been playing a role for 3 years, and the real Maria Reyes was about to surface in ways that would shatter everything they thought they knew about failure, about justice, and about who really holds the power. The courtroom at the Los Angeles County Superior Court smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and the kind of institutional disinfectant that couldn't quite mask decades of human drama. I stood in the defendant's box wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that hung loose on my small frame, my hands shackled with cold metal that bit into my wrists. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of wearing perfectly pressed uniforms, this shapeless prison garb felt like the most elaborate costume I'd ever worn. Before me sat a jury of 12 people who had already made up their minds. I could see it in their faces, the subtle curl of lips, the way they avoided direct eye contact, the slight shake of heads when they thought no one was looking. To them, I was everything wrong with their world. A liar, a fraud, someone who had stolen honor from people who had earned it with blood and sacrifice. The prosecuting attorney, David Chen, stood at his podium like a man savoring his finest moment. He was everything I had once pretended to despise. Ivy League educated, designer suit that cost more than most people made in a month, and the kind of confident smile that came from never having faced real adversity. His expensive tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had never been doubted. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Chen began, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom, "we have before us today one of the most egregious cases of stolen valor and identity fraud this court has ever seen. The defendant, Maria Santos," he emphasized the name like it was something distasteful, "systematically and deliberately masqueraded as a United States military officer for personal gain, dishonoring our brave servicemen and women who risk their lives to defend our freedom." The gallery behind me was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through social media, through local news, through the gossip networks that connected my past to my present. I could feel their eyes boring into the back of my head. Could almost hear their whispered conversations and satisfied murmurs. This was better than reality television, a real-life fraud getting her comeuppance in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. In the front row sat my former classmates from Riverside Community College, their phones discreetly positioned to capture every moment of my humiliation. Jessica Martinez, who now worked as a paralegal at a mid-tier law firm, wore the same smug expression she'd perfected in college. She was the one who used to copy my homework in statistics class before turning around and calling me trailer trash when she thought I couldn't hear. Next to her sat Marcus Webb, who had asked me out junior year only to stand me up and later tell everyone at a party that he didn't date charity cases. Behind them, Professor Williams occupied an entire row with his department colleagues. Dr. Robert Williams, distinguished professor of criminal justice, the man who had looked me in the eye during his office hours and told me I would, quote, "never amount to anything in law enforcement or military service." His gray beard was perfectly trimmed, his tweed jacket immaculate, and his expression suggested he was watching a particularly satisfying conclusion to a long-running experiment. "This woman," Chen continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation as he pointed directly at me, "convinced not just one institution, but multiple universities, employers, and even romantic partners that she was an active-duty United States military officer. She wore uniforms she had no right to wear, claimed ranks she never earned, displayed medals she never received, and accepted the respect, benefits, and admiration reserved for our true heroes." I kept my expression neutral, channeling every ounce of training I'd received over the years. Maintain composure under pressure. Never let them see weakness. Control your breathing, your posture, your micro-expressions. 3 years of method acting, 3 years of becoming someone I wasn't supposed to be, all leading to this single moment in time. My court-appointed attorney, Sarah Kim, sat beside me shuffling through a stack of papers with the enthusiasm of someone who had already accepted defeat. She was young, maybe 2 years out of law school, carrying the typical public defender's caseload of 200 active files. We'd met exactly twice before today, once for 15 minutes in a holding cell, and once for a rushed consultation in a coffee shop where she'd spent most of our time answering emails on her phone. "Look, Maria," she had told me during that second meeting, stirring sugar into her third espresso of the morning. The evidence against you is overwhelming. They have photographs, witnesses, documented instances of you claiming military status for financial benefits. My advice is to take whatever plea deal they offer and hope for leniency. First offense, young woman with no prior record. You might get off with probation and community service. But I had declined every plea deal Chen's office had offered. Not because I was naive about my chances, but because I needed this trial. I needed every detail to be aired in public, every witness to be called, every piece of supposed evidence to be presented in full view of the media and the community that had already convicted me in the court of public opinion. The prosecution's first witness took the stand, and I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Dr. Rebecca Stone, Dean of Students at Riverside Community College, approached the witness box with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. She wore a conservative navy suit and the kind of pearl necklace that suggested both authority and taste. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her voice carried the crisp authority of 30 years in academic administration. Dr. Stone, Chen began, establishing his witness with the care of a master craftsman. How long have you served as Dean of Students at Riverside Community College? 12 years this fall, she replied, settling into the witness chair with practiced ease. And in that capacity, you've overseen thousands of students, correct? Approximately 15,000 students have passed through our programs during my tenure, yes. Dr. Stone, I direct your attention to the defendant, Maria Santos. Do you recognize her? Dr. Stone turned to look at me, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not quite satisfaction, but certainly vindication. Yes, I do. Ms. Santos enrolled in our criminal justice program in the fall of 2019. And what was your impression of her academic performance during her time at Riverside? Dr. Stone consulted a manila folder she had brought with her, though I suspected she had memorized every detail of my academic record. Ms. Santos's performance was deeply troubled. She failed constitutional law twice, scraped by with a D- in criminal procedure, and received incomplete grades in statistical analysis and forensic science. She was placed on academic probation in her second semester and again in her fourth semester. Chen nodded with the satisfaction of a prosecutor building an airtight case. And what about her attendance record? Abysmal. Ms. Santos missed approximately 40% of her scheduled classes. When she did attend, she was frequently late, unprepared, and disruptive to other students. Disruptive how, specifically? Dr. Stone's voice took on a note of professional disapproval. She would often interrupt professors to share what she claimed were experiences from her military service. She'd contradict established legal precedents with stories about how things were, quote, really done in military courts or criminal investigations. When professors attempted to redirect the conversation back to the curriculum, she would become argumentative and defensive. I watched the jury absorb this testimony, saw the postal worker in the front row shake his head slightly, saw the retired teacher purse her lips in disapproval. These were people who respected education, who believed in following rules and earning your achievements through hard work and dedication. Dr. Stone, did Ms. Santos ever provide documentation of this claimed military service? We requested such documentation multiple times. Ms. Santos claimed she was dealing with, quote, classified assignments that prevented her from sharing details of her service record. When pressed for basic information, unit assignment, deployment history, even a simple DD-214 form, she became evasive and ultimately hostile. What was your final assessment of her character during this time? Dr. Stone paused, choosing her words with academic precision. Unreliable. Dishonest about assignments and absences. She claimed military obligations to excuse her poor performance, but we could find no record of any such service. When faculty members attempted to verify her claims through official channels, we discovered there was no Maria Santos listed in any military database we could access. And how did Ms. Santos respond when confronted with these discrepancies? She became increasingly defensive and paranoid. She accused the faculty of discrimination, claimed we were sabotaging her because we, quote, couldn't handle a real soldier in the classroom. Eventually, she simply stopped attending classes altogether and was academically dismissed in the spring of 2021. Chen thanked Dr. Stone and called his next witness, my former supervisor at Mitchell Security Services, where I had worked part-time during my supposedly disastrous college career. James Mitchell was a large man in his 50s who looked uncomfortable in his suit and tie, more accustomed to security guard uniforms and late-night shifts at office buildings. Mr. Mitchell, you employed the defendant at your security company from 2020 to 2021, correct? That's right. She worked weekend shifts, mainly guarding construction sites and empty office buildings. And did Ms. Santos make any claims about her background when you hired her? Mitchell shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at me before answering. She told me she was active-duty military, said she needed part-time work to supplement her military pay, claimed she had special training in surveillance and threat assessment. Did you verify these claims? I tried to. Asked for references from her commanding officer, wanted to see some kind of military ID. She always had excuses, said her unit was deployed, said her paperwork was tied up in some kind of security review. Eventually, I let it slide because she seemed competent enough and we were short-staffed. How did her claimed military experience affect her work performance? Mitchell looked genuinely puzzled. That's the weird thing. She was actually good at the job, really good. She spotted security vulnerabilities I'd never noticed, had suggestions for improving our patrol routes and reporting procedures. She handled herself like someone with real training. Chen frowned slightly, this not being the direction he wanted the testimony to go. But you eventually discovered her claims were false? Well, when this whole story broke in the news, I did some digging. Called the military liaison office, ran her name through various databases. No record of any Maria Santos in active service or reserves. The next witness was someone I had been dreading, Elena Vasquez, my former roommate and the closest thing I'd had to a friend during my time at Riverside. Elena had been studying nursing, worked 2 jobs to pay for school, and had genuinely believed in our friendship. When she took the stand, I saw hurt in her eyes that cut deeper than all the academic and professional testimony combined. Ms. Vasquez, Chen began gently, you shared an apartment with the defendant for approximately 18 months, correct? Yes, Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. From January 2020 to June 2021. During that time, did Ms. Santos discuss her military service with you? Elena's voice grew stronger, tinged with anger and betrayal. Every single day. She told me she was a lieutenant in military intelligence, said she was working on classified operations to combat domestic terrorism. She'd get phone calls at all hours that she claimed were from her commanding officer, would disappear for days at a time on what she called, quote, training exercises. Did you ever question these claims? Why would I? She seemed to know things about military procedures, about government operations. She helped me study for my anatomy classes by explaining field medicine techniques she said she'd learned in the Army. She knew details about military bases, about weapon systems, about investigation procedures. Ms. Vasquez, how did the defendant's claimed military status affect your relationship? Elena's composure began to crack, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. I looked up to her. My brother is deployed in Afghanistan, and I thought Maria understood what military families go through. She'd comfort me when I was worried about him, said she knew he was safe because she had contacts who could check on his unit. Did the defendant ever use her claimed military status for personal benefit? She got military discounts at restaurants and stores. She was accepted into a veterans support group at school that helped with tuition assistance. And? Elena paused, struggling with the words. She dated my cousin Roberto for 6 months. He's a Marine veteran with PTSD, and he connected with her because he thought she understood what he'd been through in combat. Chen's voice softened with practiced sympathy. How did you feel when you learned that Ms. Santos's military service was fabricated? Elena looked directly at me for the first time since taking the stand, and the pain in her expression was worse than any legal consequence I might face. Betrayed. Used. She let me believe in her, let my family trust her. My cousin Roberto still won't talk about it. Finding out she was lying destroyed something in him that was just starting to heal. The testimony continued for hours. Professor Williams took the stand to detail my academic failures and disruptive behavior in his classes. Jessica Martinez testified about my claims of military expertise during study groups. Marcus Webb described a date where I had supposedly received an urgent call from my unit commander. Each witness painted the same picture: Maria Santos as a pathological liar who had constructed an elaborate fantasy about military service to gain respect, benefits, and sympathy she didn't deserve. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Photographs of me in military uniforms at various social events, documentation of benefits I had claimed, testimony from dozens of people who had heard me describe my fabricated service record. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that every single detail of my performance had been carefully planned and meticulously documented. Every conversation, every appearance, every moment of my supposed deception had been part of an operation that went far deeper than anything they could imagine. My phone, which had been confiscated as evidence and sat on the prosecutor's table throughout the trial, suddenly began to buzz. Not the casual vibration of a text message, but the insistent, repeated pattern of an urgent call. Then again. And again. Chen paused mid-sentence, glancing at the device with irritation. His confident expression flickered for just a moment as he read something on the screen that clearly wasn't part of his prepared case. The buzzing continued, growing more insistent. Other phones in the courtroom began to ring. The bailiff's radio crackled to life. Judge Harrison's clerk leaned forward to whisper something urgent in her ear. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty I'd heard all day, "may we have a brief recess? There seems to be some urgent communication regarding this case that requires immediate attention." Judge Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over this courtroom for 2 decades, checked her watch with visible annoyance. "Very well, counselor. 15 minutes. As the courtroom began to empty for recess, conversations buzzing with speculation about the interruption, I caught sight of movement near the back doors. A man in a pristine military dress uniform stood just inside the courtroom, his presence commanding attention without effort. He was older, maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of decades of command experience. His uniform was immaculate, army dress blues with ribbons and insignia that indicated significant rank and extensive combat experience. When our eyes met across the crowded courtroom, he gave me the slightest nod. A gesture so subtle that anyone watching might have dismissed it as imagination, but I recognized it immediately. It was a signal I had been waiting 3 years to see. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. After 3 years of preparation, after months of playing the part of a disgraced fraud, after enduring the testimony of people who thought they knew who I really was, the moment I had been waiting for was finally here. The officer approached the prosecutor's table with measured steps, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. Several people in the gallery turned to watch, sensing that something significant was happening but unable to identify exactly what. He spoke quietly to Chen, whose face went progressively paler with each word. I watched as the prosecutor's confident demeanor crumbled, replaced by confusion and what looked like genuine panic. "I'm sorry," Chen said, his voice rising slightly. "But you're saying what, exactly?" The officer handed him a thick manila envelope, sealed with official government stamps. "I'm saying, counselor, that you might want to verify your facts before you proceed any further with this case." I watched from the defendant's box as Chen opened the envelope with hands that were now visibly shaking. Documents spilled across the prosecutor's table, official letterheads bearing the seal of the Department of Defense, photographs with classified markings, commendations signed by generals whose names I recognized from news reports about military operations around the world. Sarah Kim, my public defender, leaned forward with sudden interest. For the first time since we'd met, she looked alert and engaged. "What's happening? Who is that man?" I looked at her for the first time with something other than resignation, allowing the smallest smile to cross my face. "The truth." The recess stretched beyond 15 minutes as Chen huddled with the mysterious officer and a growing number of official-looking individuals who seemed to materialize from nowhere. I remained in the defendant's box, hands still shackled, watching the controlled chaos unfold around me while my mind drifted back to how this elaborate performance had begun. 3 years earlier, I had been a completely different person. Maria Santos, the name I'd worn like an ill-fitting costume for so long, had been my reality then. Not the manufactured failure they were describing in court, but someone equally far from the truth of who I really was. I was 22 years old, working the night shift at a 24-hour diner called Mel's on the outskirts of Riverside, serving coffee to truckers and insomniacs while taking classes at the community college during the day. My real name then was Maria Esperanza Reyes, though I dropped the middle name and changed the last one when I started college. The transformation had seemed necessary at the time. Maria Santos sounded more approachable, less obviously Latina, more likely to fit in with the predominantly white criminal justice program at Riverside. The apartment I shared with Elena was a cramped 2-bedroom in a complex that had seen better decades. The walls were thin enough that we could hear our neighbors' arguments, the heating was sporadic at best, and the parking lot was a patchwork of potholes and broken asphalt. But it was ours, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me. My childhood had been a series of foster homes and group facilities scattered across Southern California. My mother, Sofia Reyes, had been an undocumented immigrant who died in a car accident when I was 8 years old. With no known relatives and no legal status to complicate things, I became a ward of the state, bouncing between families who were either overwhelmed by their own problems or saw foster children as a source of additional income rather than human beings who needed stability and care. The Hendersons were religious fundamentalists who made me pray for forgiveness for my mother's sins every night before bed. The Kowalskis were hoarders whose house was so cluttered with junk that I slept on a mattress surrounded by towers of old newspapers and broken appliances. The Garcias were kind, but had 6 biological children of their own, and simply couldn't provide the individual attention that a traumatized 8-year-old needed. By the time I aged out of the foster system at 18, I had lived in 12 different homes and attended 9 different schools. I had learned to be quiet, to be grateful, to never ask for too much or expect anything to last. Most importantly, I had learned to become whoever the people around me needed me to be in order to survive. At Riverside, I threw myself into my studies with the desperate intensity of someone who saw education as the only path to a different life. Criminal justice appealed to me because it promised structure, clear rules, and the possibility of being someone who protected others instead of someone who always needed protection. I imagined myself as a police detective, solving cases and bringing justice to victims who reminded me of my younger self. But the program was harder than I had anticipated, and not just academically. The professors assumed a level of background knowledge that I simply didn't have. My classmates came from families where parents were lawyers, police officers, or military veterans. They understood the unspoken codes and cultural references that flew over my head. They had internships lined up through family connections, while I was working 30 hours a week at the diner just to pay rent. Professor Williams was particularly dismissive of students like me. He had served as a police officer in Orange County before getting his PhD in criminology, and he made it clear that he believed real law enforcement required a certain type of background and breeding that couldn't be taught in a classroom. During my first semester, he pulled me aside after class to suggest that I might be more suited to social work or victim advocacy, rather than actual law enforcement. Police work requires split-second decision-making under pressure, he had told me, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor by crushing my dreams early. It requires understanding complex legal procedures, managing relationships with district attorneys and judges, commanding respect from suspects and colleagues alike. These aren't skills you can learn from a textbook, Miss Santos. They come from background, from experience, from a certain type of family upbringing. His words stung because part of me believed he was right. I didn't have the confident bearing of my classmates, didn't speak with their casual authority, didn't have their unconscious assumption that doors would open for them. When Jessica Martinez talked about her father's law firm or Marcus Webb mentioned his uncle, the federal judge, I felt the familiar flutter of inadequacy that had followed me through every foster home and classroom. But I was determined to prove Williams wrong. I studied harder than anyone else in the program, spent hours in the library researching cases and legal precedents, practiced mock interrogations with Elena until she begged me to stop. I volunteered for every extra credit opportunity, attended every guest lecture, and tried to participate in class discussions, even when my voice shook with nervousness. It wasn't enough. My grades were mediocre at best, and I could see the disappointment in professors' eyes when they handed back exams with red marks bleeding across the pages. I failed constitutional law the first time because I couldn't memorize the endless list of Supreme Court cases and their implications. Criminal procedure was a nightmare of technical language and procedural requirements that seemed designed to exclude people like me. The breaking point came during my third semester. In Williams's advanced criminal investigation course, we were discussing interrogation techniques, and he had shown a video of a detective questioning a suspect in a murder case. The detective was aggressive, intimidating, using psychological pressure to break down the suspect's resistance. "This is textbook interrogation," Williams announced to the class. "Notice how Detective Morrison maintains control of the conversation, how he uses the suspect's emotional vulnerabilities against him. This is what separates real police work from what you see on television." I raised my hand, my heart pounding, but my conviction stronger than my fear. "Professor Williams, isn't that approach likely to produce false confessions? The suspect appears to be mentally impaired, and the detective is clearly leading him toward predetermined answers, rather than seeking the truth." The classroom fell silent. Williams stared at me with an expression that mixed surprise with annoyance. "Miss Santos, I think you're confusing criminal investigation with social work again. The goal of interrogation is to solve crimes and protect society, not to coddle criminals." Quote, "But if the confession is false, then the real criminal remains free and an innocent person goes to prison," I persisted. "Shouldn't we be more concerned with finding the actual truth rather than just closing cases?" Several of my classmates exchanged glances. Jessica Martinez rolled her eyes dramatically. Marcus Webb smirked and whispered something to the student next to him that made them both laugh. Williams's face flushed red. "Miss Santos, your naivete is showing. Police officers don't have the luxury of academic theorizing. They deal with real criminals who commit real crimes against real victims. If you're not prepared to accept the realities of law enforcement, perhaps you should reconsider your career goals." After class, he asked me to stay behind. The conversation that followed would haunt me for years. "Maria," he said, using my first name in a way that felt patronizing rather than friendly, "I've been teaching criminal justice for 15 years. I've seen hundreds of students come through this program, and I can usually tell within the first semester who has what it takes to succeed in law enforcement." I waited, knowing what was coming but hoping I was wrong. "You're clearly intelligent, and your work ethic is admirable. But intelligence and effort aren't enough. Police work, military service, federal law enforcement, these careers require a certain type of person. Someone who understands authority, who can command respect, who has the background and bearing to function in high-pressure situations." He paused, studying my face as if he could read my entire life story in my expression. "You don't have that background, Maria. You're not from a military family. You don't have relatives in law enforcement. You've never been in situations where life and death decisions had to be made instantly. And frankly, you don't have the presence or authority that these careers demand. You'd never make it through police academy, and you certainly would never succeed in military service." His words felt like physical blows. "But Professor Williams, I could learn." "Some things can't be learned," he interrupted. "They have to be lived. My advice to you is to find a career path that better matches your background and natural abilities. Social work, victim advocacy, maybe teaching elementary school. Those are honorable professions that would suit someone with your circumstances." Quote, I left his office feeling hollowed out, like something essential had been carved away from my center. For weeks afterward, I went through the motions of attending classes and studying, but Williams's words echoed in my head during every lecture, every exam, every interaction with classmates who seemed to possess the effortless confidence he claimed I lacked. The failure in constitutional law came next, then the incomplete in criminal procedure when I became too demoralized to complete the final project. My attendance became sporadic as I picked up extra shifts at the diner to pay for rent and textbooks. The academic probation notices felt like confirmation of everything Williams had told me about my limitations. Elena tried to be supportive, but she was dealing with her own struggles in nursing school and working 2 jobs to stay afloat. Our friendship was one of the few bright spots in my life during that period. She was genuine in a way that my foster families never had been, accepting my background without judgment and treating me like family in a way I'd never experienced. It was Elena who suggested I might benefit from talking to someone about my academic struggles. There's a counselor at school who specializes in helping first-generation college students, she told me one evening, as we sat in our tiny kitchen, sharing a dinner of ramen noodles and canned soup. Maybe she could help you figure out a different approach to your classes. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the counselor Elena recommended, was everything Professor Williams was not. She was Latina like me, had grown up in a working-class family, and had struggled through her own undergraduate years while working multiple jobs. Her office was warm and welcoming, filled with plants and photographs of students who had successfully graduated despite facing similar challenges. "Tell me about your goals," she said during our first meeting. "Not what your professors think you should do, not what seems practical or realistic. What do you actually want to accomplish with your life?" For the first time in months, I allowed myself to be completely honest. I want to serve my country. I want to protect people who can't protect themselves. I want to prove that someone like me, someone from nowhere, with no family, no connections, no advantages, can still make a difference. Dr. Rodriguez listened without judgment, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about my background and motivations. At the end of our session, she said something that would change the entire trajectory of my life. "Maria, have you ever considered military service? Not as a backup plan or a consolation prize, but as a genuine path to the goals you've described?" I shook my head. "Professor Williams said I'd never make it in the military. He said I don't have the right background or bearing." Dr. Rodriguez's expression darkened. "Professor Williams has been telling students like you and me for years that we don't belong in positions of authority. He's wrong. The military values merit, dedication, and performance over background and connections. Some of the most effective officers I've known came from circumstances similar to yours." She pulled out a business card and handed it to me. "This is Captain Jennifer Walsh. She's a Marine recruiter, but more importantly, she's someone who understands what it means to overcome obstacles that other people think are insurmountable. I think you should talk to her." The meeting with Captain Walsh took place the following week at the Marine Corps recruiting station in downtown Riverside. I was nervous, still hearing Williams's voice telling me I didn't have what it takes, but Walsh put me at ease within the first few minutes of our conversation. She was in her early 30s, compact and athletic, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested she'd never doubted her place in the world. But when she talked about her own background, growing up in rural Alabama, first in her family to graduate high school, joining the Marines to escape poverty and prove something to herself, I recognized a kindred spirit. "The thing about the military," Walsh told me, "is that it doesn't care where you came from. It cares where you're going. Can you follow orders? Can you lead others? Can you perform under pressure? Can you learn quickly and adapt to new situations? Those are the questions that matter." She administered a preliminary aptitude test, and when the results came back, her eyebrows rose slightly. "Have you considered officer training? Your scores suggest you'd be an excellent candidate for officer candidate school." Officer training. The possibility had never occurred to me. In my limited understanding of military hierarchy, officers were people like my classmates, individuals with family connections, military backgrounds, and natural authority. They weren't former foster kids who worked at diners and struggled through community college. "I don't know if I'm officer material," I admitted. "I've been told I don't have the right kind of background or presence." Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of attention that made me feel like she was seeing something I couldn't see myself. "Maria, can I tell you something? The best officers I've served with weren't the ones who had everything handed to them. They were the ones who had to fight for everything they achieved. They understood what it meant to struggle, to overcome obstacles, to prove themselves every single day." She pulled out a thick packet of information about Marine Officer Candidate School. "This is a 10-week program that turns civilians into Marine officers. It's physically demanding, mentally challenging, and emotionally intense. About 60% of candidates don't make it through, but the ones who do graduate knowing they've earned their place through merit alone. I stared at the packet, afraid to touch it as if it might disappear if I believed in it too strongly. What if I'm not strong enough? What if Professor Williams was right about me? Then you'll find out for sure, Walsh replied. But you'll find out by testing yourself against the highest standards in the world, not by accepting someone else's opinion about your limitations. That night, I sat in my bedroom reading through the OCS materials until 3 a.m. Physical fitness requirements, academic standards, leadership challenges, evaluation criteria. It was all laid out in black and white, no family connections required, no previous military experience necessary, just the willingness to endure 10 weeks of the most demanding training the Marine Corps could devise. Elena found me the next morning, still sitting at my desk with the papers spread around me like pieces of a puzzle I was trying to solve. "You're really thinking about this," she said, not as a question but as an observation. "I think I have to," I replied. "I think this might be the only way to find out who I really am underneath all the doubt and fear." Elena sat on the edge of my bed, studying my face with the kind of concern that comes from genuine friendship. "What about school? What about your criminal justice degree?" "What about it? I'm failing anyway. Williams has made it clear that he doesn't think I belong there, and maybe he's right. Maybe I've been trying to fit into something that was never meant for me." "Or maybe," Elena said quietly, "you've been trying to fit into something that's too small for who you really are." Her words hit me like a revelation. For months, I had been trying to shrink myself down to fit into Professor Williams's narrow definition of what a criminal justice student should be. I had been apologizing for my background, minimizing my experiences, trying to become someone else's version of acceptable. But the Marine Corps wasn't asking me to be someone else. It was asking me to be the best version of myself. The decision to withdraw from Riverside and enlist in the Marine Corps felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that I would either learn to fly or discover that the fall was survivable. I spent my last week at the diner picking up extra shifts to save money, saying goodbye to the few professors who had shown me kindness, and trying to explain to Elena why I had to take this leap. "I'm proud of you," she told me on my last night in our apartment. "But I'm also scared for you. What if it's as hard as everyone says it is?" "Then it'll be hard," I replied. "But hard isn't the same as impossible. And even if I fail, at least I'll fail at something that matters, something that's worthy of the effort." The bus to Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island, left Riverside at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I carried everything I owned in a single duffel bag, wearing civilian clothes for what would be the last time in months. As the California desert rolled past the windows, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that I would later recognize as the feeling of a life-changing direction completely. I had no way of knowing that the scared young woman on that bus would emerge from the crucible of Marine training as someone entirely different. I couldn't have imagined that within 3 years, I would be sitting in a courtroom wearing shackles, while people who had once dismissed me as a failure testified about my supposed crimes. And I certainly couldn't have predicted that the moment of my greatest apparent defeat would actually be the beginning of my ultimate vindication. But as Chen continued to huddle with the mysterious officer and more official-looking individuals filled the courtroom, I allowed myself a small smile. The performance was almost over, and the real Maria Reyes was finally ready to take the stage. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as Judge Harrison returned to her bench. Chen stood at his table, his face pale and his hands visibly trembling as he clutched the manila envelope. The confident prosecutor who had begun this trial was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a man who looked like he'd just discovered his entire case was built on quicksand. "Your Honor," Chen began, his voice cracking slightly, "the prosecution requests an immediate recess to review new evidence that has come to light." Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed. In 20 years on the bench, she had developed an instinct for when something significant was happening. "Mr. Chen, you've had months to prepare this case. What possible new evidence could require an immediate recess?" Chen glanced desperately at the military officer who still stood near the prosecutor's table, then back at the judge. "Your Honor, it appears there may have been fundamental errors in our understanding of the defendant's background and status." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jessica Martinez leaned forward in her seat, her phone still recording. Professor Williams frowned, clearly annoyed by this interruption to what he had expected to be a straightforward conviction. The military officer stepped forward, his bearing commanding instant attention from everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, if I may. I am Colonel James Morrison, United States Marine Corps, Office of Military Justice. I have documentation that directly pertains to this case. Judge Harrison studied the man carefully. His uniform was immaculate, his ribbons and insignia indicating decades of distinguished service. This was not someone who would interrupt a civilian court proceeding without serious cause. Proceed, Colonel Morrison. Morrison opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents. Your Honor, the defendant in this case is not Maria Santos, as indicated on the court dockets. Her legal name is General Maria Esperanza Reyes, United States Marine Corps. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Elena Vasquez, who had been sitting quietly in the back, covered her mouth with her hands. Dr. Stone, still in the witness area, went white as a sheet. Furthermore, Morrison continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, General Reyes has been operating under deep cover for the past 3 years as part of a joint FBI military intelligence operation investigating corruption within academic institutions that receive federal funding. Professor Williams shot to his feet. That's impossible! I know this girl. She failed my classes. She was academically dismissed. Professor Williams, Morrison said, turning to face him directly, you were one of the primary targets of the investigation. The silence that followed was deafening. Chen sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The jury sat in stunned bewilderment, trying to process the complete reversal of everything they had heard over the past 2 days. Morrison approached the bench and handed Judge Harrison a thick folder. Your Honor, these documents contain General Reyes's actual service record, classification clearances, and operational authorization for the undercover mission designated Operation Academic Integrity. I watched from the defendant's box as Judge Harrison reviewed the documents, her experienced eyes scanning page after page of official military correspondence, FBI authorizations, and classified operational directives. With each page she turned, her expression grew more grave. Colonel Morrison, she said finally, are you telling this court that everything we've heard over the past 2 days, the academic failures, the stolen valor allegations, the claims of fraud, all of it was part of an authorized military operation? That is correct, Your Honor. General Reyes graduated first in her class from Officer Candidates School, completed advanced intelligence training at Quantico, and was hand-selected for this operation by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Her apparent failures at Riverside Community College were carefully orchestrated to establish her cover identity. Morrison turned to address the gallery, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom. For 3 years, General Reyes endured mockery, dismissal, and character assassination while gathering evidence of a systematic corruption scheme involving federal education funds, fraudulent veteran benefits, and academic misconduct. Dr. Stone stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous! I demand to see proof. Dr. Stone, Morrison interrupted, pulling out another document. You might want to remain silent. This is a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The courtroom erupted. Dr. Stone went white and sat down heavily. Several people in the gallery began talking at once. Professor Williams looked like he was having trouble breathing. Judge Harrison banged her gavel repeatedly. Order! Order in this court! Morrison waited for quiet before continuing. The investigation revealed that Professor Williams, Dr. Stone, and several other faculty members were systematically denying academic opportunities to minority and first-generation college students while steering federal diversity and inclusion funding into personal accounts. He held up a thick binder. General Reyes documented instances where qualified students were given failing grades regardless of their actual performance, where federal grants meant to support disadvantaged students were redirected to personal use, and where academic probation was used as a weapon against students who didn't fit certain demographic profiles. Professor Williams finally found his voice. This is insane! I never... Professor Williams, Morrison said, his tone ice cold, we have 3 years of recordings. Every conversation, every dismissive comment, every instance where you told a promising student they would never amount to anything. All of it was captured and documented. He gestured toward me. When Professor Williams told General Reyes that she would never succeed in military service, he was unknowingly speaking to an officer who was already being groomed for promotion to the rank of brigadier general. The revelation sent another shockwave through the courtroom. Elena was openly crying now, but they seemed to be tears of pride rather than betrayal. Several of the veterans in the gallery had stood up, their faces showing a mixture of amazement and respect. Morrison continued his methodical dismantling of the case. The security guard job, the part-time work, even the supposed personality conflicts with roommates, all of it was carefully constructed to support General Reyes's cover identity while she gathered evidence. He turned to Elena. Ms. Vasquez, you testified that the defendant helped you study for anatomy classes using military field medicine techniques. You didn't realize it at the time, but you were receiving instruction from someone with advanced combat medical training. Quote, Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. She saved my grade in that class. I never would have passed without her help. And Mr. Mitchell, Morrison addressed my former security supervisor, when you noted that the defendant seemed to have real training and made excellent suggestions for security improvements, you were observing the work of someone with advanced intelligence and reconnaissance training. James Mitchell, who had testified earlier about my supposed deception, looked stunned. You mean she really did have military training? Extensive training, Morrison confirmed. General Reyes is qualified in multiple forms of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and security assessment. Her suggestions for improving your security protocols were likely better than anything you could have received from a private consulting firm. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Colonel Morrison, what about the specific charges in this case? The stolen valor allegations? Morrison's expression grew stern. Your Honor, the uniforms General Reyes wore were her own, earned through years of distinguished service. The ranks she claimed were her actual ranks. The only deception was allowing people to believe she was lying about her service, when in fact, every detail was true. He pulled out another document. General Reyes has been awarded 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the Defense Superior Service Medal. She served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, where she led intelligence operations that saved countless American lives. The prosecutor, Chen, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Your Honor, he said weakly, if this is true, then the charges. The charges were fabricated, Morrison said bluntly, not by Mr. Chen, but by the individuals being investigated. Professor Williams filed the initial complaint knowing it was false, hoping to discredit General Reyes before she could expose his activities. Professor Williams stood up again, his face red with anger and panic. I demand proof. I demand to see these so-called recordings. Morrison nodded to someone near the back of the courtroom. A moment later, speakers crackled to life, and Professor Williams's own voice filled the room. Police work, military service, federal law enforcement. These careers require a certain type of person, someone who understands authority, who can command respect, who has the background and bearing to function in high-pressure situations. You don't have that background, Maria. You'd never make it through police academy, and you certainly would never succeed in military service. The recording continued with other conversations, other instances of Williams dismissing students, other examples of the systematic discrimination that had been the target of the investigation. Williams sank into his seat, the fight gone out of him. Judge Harrison turned to me. General Reyes, I believe it's time we heard from you directly. I stood up, and for the first time in 3 years, I allowed my real bearing to show. The shackles suddenly seemed absurd. Chains on someone who had commanded troops in combat, who had earned the respect of generals, who had sacrificed 3 years of her life to expose corruption and protect other students from the discrimination I had pretended to endure. Your Honor, I said, my voice carrying the authority that I had hidden for so long. 3 years ago, I was approached by the FBI and asked to investigate credible reports of systematic discrimination and fraud at institutions receiving federal education funding. Riverside Community College was identified as a primary target based on complaints from former students and federal auditors. I gestured toward the gallery. The people in this courtroom who knew me as Maria Santos, The failing student, the wannabe soldier, the fraud. They knew exactly who they were meant to know. Every interaction was designed to expose the truth about how minority students, first-generation college students, and anyone deemed unfit by certain faculty members were being treated. Professor Williams tried to interrupt, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a look. Professor Williams told me I would never amount to anything in law enforcement or military service. What he didn't know was that I had already been selected for promotion to general, the youngest female general in Marine Corps history. His assessment wasn't based on my capabilities, but on his prejudices about my background and ethnicity. I turned to face Elena. Elena, I'm sorry for the deception, but every moment of our friendship was real. When I helped you study, when I listened to your worries about your brother, when I supported you through difficult times, that was me, the real me, not the character I was playing. Quote. Elena nodded through her tears. I know, she whispered. I know. Judge Harrison reviewed the documents one more time. General Reyes, Colonel Morrison, this is certainly the most unusual case I've encountered in my career. What is the current status of the investigation? Morrison stepped forward. The investigation is complete, Your Honor. We have sufficient evidence to pursue federal charges against Professor Williams, Dr. Stone, and several other individuals. The Justice Department will be announcing indictments next week. And what about these proceedings? All charges against General Reyes should be dismissed immediately. She has committed no crimes, quite the opposite. She has served her country with distinction while enduring personal sacrifice that few could imagine. Judge Harrison nodded. Motion granted. All charges against General Reyes are hereby dismissed. She paused, then added, General, on behalf of this court and this community, I want to thank you for your service and for your sacrifice in exposing this corruption. The courtroom erupted in applause. The veterans in the gallery stood at attention and saluted. Elena pushed through the crowd to reach me, tears of joy streaming down her face. As the bailiff removed my shackles, I felt the weight of 3 years lifting from my shoulders. The scared young woman who had left Riverside for Marine training had become exactly what Professor Williams said she never could be, not despite her background, but because of the strength and determination it had given her. Chen approached me as the courtroom began to clear. General Reyes, I owe you an apology. I was completely deceived. Mr. Chen, I replied, you were doing your job based on the information you had. The people who filed false charges knew exactly what they were doing. As I walked out of the courthouse, no longer in shackles, but in the dress blue uniform that Colonel Morrison had brought for me, I thought about Elena's words from 3 years ago. Maybe you've been trying to fit into something that's too small for who you really are. She had been right. I hadn't failed at Riverside. I had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination at something much more important. And Professor Williams, who had told me I would never amount to anything, would soon learn what it felt like to be judged by someone who had achieved everything he said was impossible. The real Maria Reyes had finally taken the stage, and the performance was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. For the first time in 3 years, I was ready to tell my story, not as Maria Santos, the failed student, but as General Maria Esperanza Reyes, United States Marine Corps. The girl from nowhere had become someone who mattered, and no one would ever again be able to convince her otherwise. Justice never arrives on time, but when it does, it echoes louder than betrayal ever could. No wall of prejudice can stand forever against the tide of truth and determination. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from proving you belong, but from proving that those who said you didn't belong were wrong about everything that matters. Asterisk. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.